So this evening, I would like to welcome Sarah McCollum, who is going to be doing her presentation on workhouses of rural Ulster. Sarah is currently in her first year of a PhD, looking at the impact of religion and philanthropy on the workings of the poor law in rural Ulster. Her master's dissertation looked at child welfare provision in Limavady Workhouse, and her PhD thesis is connected to this original research. Sarah lives in Limavady and has a keen interest in the poor law in this general area. So thank you for coming along this evening, Sarah, and you're very welcome, and we're really looking forward to your talk. So I'll hand over now to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanne, for introducing me and asking me to come along. I think probably this is based off of a talk I actually did that Joanne heard me give in Limavady Workhouse a wee while ago. So as she's explained, I'm doing my PhD at the minute in social history in Queen's. And the talk I'm about to give you is based on the research I'm currently doing, as well as my master's research, and also based around research that one of my PhD supervisors has actually completed on Ballycastle Workhouse. So the title of my master's research was Seen But Not Heard, Child Welfare Provision in Limavady Union from 1860 to 1921. And my PhD research title at the minute, it'll probably change several times before I'm finished, is Religion, Charity and the Poor Law in the Rural Unions of Ulster. Maybe Nick is actually going to be my lovely assistant and put up the PowerPoint because it wouldn't work for me. So I have an image there of Limavady Workhouse, and it kind of gives you some indication of what most workhouses looked like around Ireland at the time. Limavady's workhouse is the best preserved workhouse. It's fully there. The only thing that's not really there are the walls that surrounded it. So if you want to know what the workhouses in Ireland really look
there,
like,
it's not coming out of there.
That's someone's talking there. Yeah, so this is what it looked like at the time. So I'm actually interested in social history as it looks at people like you and me and how they actually lived their life. So if I think about school history and the history that we've looked at in the past, it tends to focus on the bigger players, the bigger picture. So it focuses on kings and queens and maybe the politics that surround an event. So if you think about it, World War II, everybody knows something about World War II, or Henry VIII, everybody knows him. And even if you think about this period of history, when you think about the workhouse, the things that we all think about is the Great Famine in Ireland. But what I'm really interested in is not that bigger picture. I'm interested in the people that are just like us. I want to understand how they lived. I want to know how the laws and those big events actually impacted them and their daily lives. And I want to know what strategies did they employ to get around difficulties in their lives. So if you take the example of the Poor Law, which was the law that actually introduced workhouses, if I take that as an example, I can tell you from legal history, I can tell you that the workhouse and the Poor Law was introduced in order to provide relief to the truly destitute poor. And it was only for those people. That was the only reason that you should enter the workhouse. However, throughout the many, many years that the Poor Law governed Ireland, the Irish people actually used the workhouse in a very different way. It was definitely not the way the authors of the law would have intended it. So for example, you were to enter if you were truly destitute, and you would probably be there for quite a lengthy period of time. But by the end of the Poor Law, you can actually see that many Irish people used the workhouse as night lodgers. So they will have entered for one night, and then they would maybe move on to a different workhouse a couple of nights later. And they moved around the workhouses in Ireland as they searched for work. And it was used in a more casual manner than the architects of the law probably ever intended it. And historians have studied the law specifically in the past, and all studying the law can really tell us is what the lawmakers intended with the law. Yet for my research, what I want to understand is, how did the people on the ground actually use the law? And if you take the Great Famine as an example, we often hear about the mistakes of the British government. We can hear about how politicians used the mistakes of the British government, used the conditions of the workhouse to feed into a political agenda. But we don't really hear about the experiences of the people on the ground. And I was interested to understand what was the impact of the poor law on maybe that teenage girl who was forced to emigrate from Limavady Workhouse, or the orphaned children of Ballymoney and Coleraine, or what about a starving widow from Ballycastle? And if Nick, there's a wee slide there now too. And this record here that Nick's about to put up, this is an indoor register. This is actually Limavady's indoor register. It's one of many books in the Public Records Office. And the records, these are the types of records that I look at. And what it actually does is it shows you people's names. And by finding their names and by having several books to flick through, you can actually follow a family or a person, and you can see them appearing in the record time and time again. And you begin to see them appearing, and then you can begin to create a picture as to what they were maybe doing. And if you look there at that slide, you can see that it lists, it gives them a number, it gives them a date when they go in and a number, and you can see their name, but you can also see the area that they come from. So you can see that people using Limavady Workhouse were not always from Limavady. So you can see Ballycastle Union, so Armoy. You can see Coleraine, Kilray is there, Antrim, Ballymoney. If you go on down, there's Clough-Mills. And if you actually look at it, there's probably more people not from Limavady than people from Limavady. So I was able to see then, as I looked through these registers, and spot people that just appeared quite a lot. And I remember finding one family and just being intrigued as to why every year at the same time, an entire family came from Dublin to Limavady Workhouse. And having looked at it a little, it appeared that the father of the family was actually a cooper, and coopers made the barrels that whiskey is stored in. And Limavady was well known for whiskey production. So it seems that at the same point every year, he realized that he could get work in Limavady. So he would come, bring his entire family, they would stay for a couple of nights, he would have work, and then they would leave again. And it would probably be interesting to look at other registers for other unions that maybe had whiskey production nearby, and probably you would find him moving his family around Ireland. So this kind of is the motivation behind my research. So these normal people just like us. And as I go through, what I'm going to try and show to you is, this is a bit of background as to what led me into my PhD research, but I want to show you what Ireland was like. I want to show you how the poor were looked after before the poor law. And then I'm going to talk about the workhouse system, and then focus more on Ballymoney, Ballycastle, Coleraine and Limavady. And then you can ask questions at the end, but I can't guarantee you that I'll know the answer, but I'll try my best. So the next slide will show you what Ireland looked like. And I want you to pay attention to the photographs, because it's going to be important later in the talk. This gives you some indication what the environment looked like at the time in the 1800s. So the photograph on the top left gives us some indication about farming. So you can see there was a horse and cart. You can see the men in the fields, and you know, it's very manual labor. The photograph beneath that then, that's showing you a labourer's cottage. And all the other three photos actually show you labourers' cottages. And remember those, remember the condition that the people are living in. And if you actually look in most photos, you can see that I think all of the children, they don't have any shoes on or anything. And the clothing that they're wearing, that's probably the only clothing that they possess. So just bear that in mind for a future point. And even if you notice the photograph in the top right, you'll see what that is depicting is there's 3 Royal Irish Constabulary officers, and they're actually evicting a family. So you see all of their stuff piled up outside. So just remember those conditions for a future point that I'll make. It's important that we keep that image in our minds. And before the Poor Law was introduced, there was actually no state-funded approach to poverty in Ireland. So England had had one since, I think it was 1601. So during the reign of Elizabeth I, they had a poor law to provide relief or help for people in England, but Ireland didn't have one. And so in Ireland, before this law was introduced, if you needed help of any sort, what you had to do was you had to go and you had to find yourself an almshouse or a voluntary workhouse. So there's a voluntary workhouse still in Belfast. It was set up by Mary Ann McCracken. You could find for foundling children, there was foundling hospitals, and then your other options were charitable or religious organisations. However, in the early 1800s, Britain began to realise that something needed to be done about the poverty in Ireland. And I'm going to rewind a wee bit here to create the picture of what caused them to make this decision, like what changed, what made them want to do something about it. Because there had always been poor in Ireland. This wasn't a new thing. And they'd always been divided into 2 categories. The first category was the deserving poor, and the second category was the undeserving poor. So deserving poor were orphans, widows, deserted women and children, the sick and the aged, and the undeserving poor was anyone who was able to work, but they just weren't working. So basically, why then did Britain decide at this point something actually has to be done now? And as with everything in history, it's all connected. And you've probably all heard of the Napoleonic Wars. So the war with France. So that was between 1803 and 1815. And so for those years, Britain was at war with France. And that meant then that Britain couldn't trade with Europe. So Europe were not exporting to Britain. So that meant they had to get their goods from somewhere else. So they had to get them from Britain itself and Ireland. So this was good for Ireland. And as the wars came to an end then, the economy in Ireland was greatly affected by those wars ending because now exports could now happen from Europe. And also on top of that, there was a lot of soldiers fighting in that war that were from Ireland. Now we have a large group of men who had been soldiers returning to Ireland, trying desperately to find work, and there just wasn't any work. So what they did then was they went to try and find work somewhere else. Where are they going to go to try and find work? Where's the closest? So they went across the water to England and to Scotland. So basically, England knew that there was poverty in Ireland, but whilst poverty stayed in Ireland, everything was okay. But when it came to their doorstep, this was now a problem. And when they saw the Irish in their own towns and cities, they realised that the Irish were actually in quite a high state of poverty. And one of their biggest concerns was their morality. They thought that they were a very immoral people and something really needed to be done to try and address the issue. On top of all of that then, the British government had thought that they had achieved a great feat by giving Catholic emancipation or Catholic freedom in 1829, and they were trying to prevent the Irish from rebelling and from causing any agitation within Ireland, and it didn't really work. So they thought once and for all, we're going to have to do something big here and very dramatic to try and address this issue. Maybe if we address poverty, we'll stop them rebelling all of the time. And what they did was they asked commissioners to do a survey of Ireland. And the commissioners travelled around Ireland and they interviewed various people to try and understand poverty in the country. And these commissioners were either people who lived in Ireland or who were from Ireland. And this took about 3 years for the entire process to be completed. And their recommendation was that there was a high level of poverty in Ireland, and what the British government had implemented in England probably wasn't going to work in Ireland. They concluded that there was basically too many people and that it would be better to continue with the voluntary approach to charity. And then the government could focus most of its attention and funding towards improving the country, improving its infrastructure, and improving its education. So this report took 3 years, and the government didn't like the findings of the report. So what does any good government do when they don't like the findings of a report? They send out another group of commissioners to try and get the conclusion that they would like. So this next set of commissioners now go into Ireland, and they were so amazing that they could do what the other group took 3 years to do. They did it in 6 weeks. And the recommendations from this group was that they should just introduce a similar system to England. And so in 1838, the Act for the Effectual Relief of the Destitute Poor in Ireland was introduced. And this was the first national system of poor relief. And this was a massive law. And in actual fact, it has implications even for us today. So you can think 1838 was a long time ago. What does it really matter? But it was a stepping stone to the environment that we now live in. So we can assume that, yes, of course, we know the past was different. You know, we can say they didn't have cars, their transport wasn't great, their medicine wasn't brilliant, their houses were poor in comparison to ours. But we also forget that the government's involvement in people's lives was very different back then than it is now. And this is the first step towards what we know today. So as you study 19th and 20th century Ireland and this poor law, you can begin to see that the government increases its vigilance of the population. So think about compulsory education, the various children's acts, the creation of the NSPCC, compulsory vaccinations, the beginnings of social work as a profession. And all of these things began with concerns over poverty and this law. And here we see the start of the welfare state. And to understand why they felt this needed dealt with, it's because they saw poverty as corrupting and they wanted to protect the entire nation from this corruption. And essentially the purpose of the law was not to address the issue of poverty. The purpose of the law was to deal with the problem of the poor. And there is a difference. They felt that the poor needed to be reformed, and this law was the potential way to try and reform them. And as I mentioned before, the famine seems to be the main focus when we think about the workhouse, but this act was in place for 87 years in the whole of Ireland and 110 years in the north of Ireland. But the main thing most of us know about this law is the 6 years of the famine. And this law was more than the famine. It was more than its failures. And we really, really should know more about it than those 6 years. So the next image shows you the man who actually introduced the law. He came up with it. This was the man that was really good and could do all of his work in 6 weeks. This is George Nichols, and he was an English commissioner. And there was one line in his report that actually really stood out to me that shows you the attitude of people towards the Irish at the time. So he concluded that the law needed to be introduced to impose order on the unruly natives. So he saw the Irish as unruly and the English were going to sort them out. So how did the poor law actually work? The next slide will show you the top half of Ireland. So it's not the full picture of Ireland, but Ireland was divided into organisational areas that were known as unions. And each union was created for the poor law, so they hadn't existed before. And you can see there at the top right, you can see the ones that I've mentioned. So Limavady wasn't known as Limavady until the 1870s. It's Newtown Limavady. You see Coleraine, Ballymoney and Ballycastle. And each of these unions were looked after or governed by local guardian boards. And the men on these boards, or guardians as they were known, they were made up of 1/3 who were appointed, and they were generally magistrates of the time. And then 2/3 of them were elected by the ratepayers. And then each union was connected to a workhouse. And then each workhouse was connected to a market town. So Limavady, Causeway and Ballycastle were successful market towns. And then each board was answerable to the central authority, which was known as the Poor Law Commission, or later the local government board, and they resided in Dublin. So the next slide as well will show you, how did these commissioners know what the Guardians were up to? This is a little snapshot of one of the minute books. So the Guardians had to take minutes at each of their weekly meetings, and they had to send those minutes down to the commissioners in Dublin for them to go through in great detail. And just by chance, the picture I put on the PowerPoint is actually the section that shows you the communication between the commissioners in Dublin and the Guardians. So again, this is Limavady's, and you can see there at the top, this section shows you letters back and forth. And they went through those minutes in such detail that you will find they picked up on the smallest thing. So little tiny errors that they maybe perceived, or things that they wanted clarified to make sure that the Guardians were following the law. So initially, there were 130 unions, and these increased during the famine and after to 163, and 43 of these were in Ulster. So the next question I have written down is, how did you get into the workhouse? And simple, you had to prove that you were needy enough. And it was based on a principle that they called less eligibility, or the workhouse test. And basically that was where, if you remember back at the start, I told you to pay attention to the photographs. And that's really very important, because what they said was that the conditions inside the workhouse needed to be worse than the worst conditions outside. So the worst labourer conditions outside the workhouse was going to be worse than that. And this was to make sure that only the absolutely desperate, truly destitute applied for relief. And this rule they'd brought over from England. And the difference was, a labourer in England, his living conditions were significantly better than that of a labourer in Ireland. So you can see why this was a bit of an issue. And as I said, the aim of the law was to make the workhouse as unappealing as possible, so people wouldn't abuse the system. And once you entered the workhouse, families were separated. So husbands and wives, we had male and female sections, but most significantly, mothers were separated from their children. If the child was above the age of 2, they were separated into the children's section. And families will have seen each other once a week on a Sunday. And you were required actually to wear a workhouse uniform. And the next slide will show you the type of clothing that you had to wear. Everybody looked the same, so your identity was stripped from you and you were put in these beautiful uniforms. And if you were found to leave the workhouse whilst you were still wearing these clothes, a warrant for your arrest would be issued for theft. And as you can see, the uniforms weren't exactly brilliant. They were made of quite an itchy fabric. It was very thick and heavy material. But to show you how desperate people were, people did leave wearing the uniform and they were arrested. And I actually found one little boy from Ballymoney, and he left with the clothing still on. And when they found him, he was sentenced to 2 months hard labour for leaving the workhouse still wearing the uniform. So quite a dramatic and harsh punishment for something quite simple. And even inside the workhouse, the conditions were pretty poor. Sanitation was awful. The rooms were often damp and very cold. And the next slide will show you kind of like a side shot of what it'll have been like. So you can see there that they slept on raised platforms and the mattresses were just filled with straw. And you had fire at one end, not at the other. And then you were locked into your dorm from 8 o'clock in the evening until the next morning. So like I said before, the Great Famine happened during the period of the Poor Law. And I'm not going to dwell on that too much because, as I've said, there's been a lot of focus on that. But the workhouses weren't designed to deal with a crisis like the famine. They were designed to deal with poverty, everyday poverty. And no one anticipated the famine when it arrived in 1845. And the next slide actually shows you a famous image of the famine. wrong image, but the next one again, flick on over to the next one. Sorry, Nick. This is a famous image of the workhouses during the famine. And one of the most famous workhouses actually at the time was Skibbereen in County Cork. And the workhouse there was built to accommodate 800 people. And quite shockingly, in the midst of the famine in 1848, there were 2,000 more people than it was built to accommodate. So they had 2,800 people crammed into Skibbereen Workhouse. And statistics show that 1 in 5 of those who actually died during the famine, they died either inside the workhouse or outside the workhouse waiting to try and get in. And there were a lot of people knew that if they traveled to the workhouse would bury you if you died or when you died, rather than you dying on the side of the road. But during the lifespan of this law, it did change quite significantly, and it became more about health, hygiene, housing, and child welfare. And that's where I come in. So I don't really focus on the period of the famine. I focus from 1850 onwards. And I'm going to look at the rural workhouses that I mentioned at the start. And quite a lot of research has been done on workhouses in Ireland, but it tends to be on the urban workhouses, so Belfast and Dublin. And this is usually because the records are clearer, there's more records to find. And there's been less work done on Ulster and rural Ulster in particular. And enter me, wise or unwise, I'm determined to try and find these records. And what I'm currently looking at are the rural workhouses of Ulster, and the areas that I'm looking at are Glentees in Donegal, Limavady, Ballymena and Clougher. And the image that we showed earlier of the unions and the map of the unions, you can actually see why I picked those, because it covers such a wide area of Ulster to try and give me a good snapshot of what was happening. And as with all unions in Ireland, the rural Ulster Guardians had quite a lot to deal with. They had very difficult tasks and decisions to make. And so now what I want to do is help us understand how these workhouses operated and what were some of the daily decisions that they had to face. And I want to look first at Ballymoney Union. I can't actually see everybody, but if you want to, raise your hand when I ask these questions. So in Ballymoney in the late 19th century, there was a population of about 3,000 people, and that was probably about half of what Coleraine or Ballymena was. But even though it was a smallish town, it was actually a very successful market town. Its main manufacturing was linen, but its most productive activity was farming. And its workhouse opened in November 1842, and it was built to house 700 paupers. The highest number of inmates were recorded during the famine, and it reached 870, so 170 over what it was built to house, so not like Skibbereen, but still a good amount more over. And the next slide should show you what Ballymoney Workhouse looks like, although it no longer exists, but you can see it looks pretty similar to Limavady's. And with regards to the Ballymoney Board of Guardians, yeah, so here's my questions. If you want to raise your hand, if you're from Ballymoney, go on ahead, but I'd be interested to know if the words I'm going to use to describe the Ballymoney Guardians describe Ballymoney people in general or just these guardians at the time. So my impression of the guardians were that they were firm, forthright, determined, clear in their own thinking, cost conscious, and most significantly, they really didn't like to be told what to do. My supervisor has written about Ballymoney Guardians, and she describes them as having, I think this is quite a good quote, a fiercely independent spirit. So it'd be interesting to know if people from Ballymoney still have that fiercely independent spirit. Ballymoney was quite a unique union. And following those awful years of the famine, the 1860s brought with it a level of prosperity. And as the farmers of the town began to make more money, then they began to buy more things in Ballymoney town, and they began to borrow money from the banks in Ballymoney. So as the farmers spent their money, the economy grew in Ballymoney, and the merchants, the bankers and the farmers developed quite a successful relationship, and they realized that they actually needed each other. And what happened then was those merchants, they realized that we've got quite a good partnership going on here with the farmers. So we should probably help the farmers out in their difficulty. And the next slide will show you a man that probably most people in Ballymoney should recognize his surname at least. I'm not from Ballymoney, but I even recognize his sorry, the next slide again, Nick. I recognize his surname. There's still a business in operation in Ballymoney today with that name attached to it. And that was Thomas McElderry. And he actually held quite a prominent position in the Root Tenants Defence Association. So he made it his mission to try and fight for the farmers' rights in Ballymoney, recognising that that relationship and the success of Ballymoney's economy was because of the farmers and their business. So why am I telling you this? It's because as these relationships developed, and you combine that with that independent Ballymoney spirit, these merchants and farmers, they began to be drawn to and voted into positions of authority in the town. And where do you get authority at this point in the town? You get it from the poor law guardians. And you find that a lot of the merchants and farmers ended up gaining positions and becoming guardians on that board. And before 1880, so the dates are important. So before 1880, most, if not all, union boards were dominated by the landlords. And when I say dominated, I mean that the landlords held those very important positions, and they were chairman, vice chairman, deputy vice chairman. But then throughout the late 1870s, but mostly in the 1880s, there was a land league political campaign that led to tenant farmers dominating those positions on those boards and replacing the landlords. However, in Northern Ireland and in Ulster, this didn't happen. It had the opposite effect. So instead of the landlords being removed from those positions, it seemed to solidify their position. But Ballymoney was different. So not only were they different to the rest of the North at this point, but they had already been shifting towards this as early as the early 1870s, and their board was dominated by merchants and tenant farmers. And it has been argued that that's due to that radical spirit that existed in Ballymoney. So by the mid-1870s, so before anywhere else in Ireland was doing it, the landlords would not hold office again in Ballymoney. So no landlord was ever chairman, vice chairman or deputy vice chairman. And I can't stress how unusual that was. And within the unions, they weren't allowed to discuss religion or politics in the boardroom. But after this move happened where tenant farmers were now taking up these positions from the 1880s on, those southern boards began to allow politics to enter their board meetings more regularly. And how they did that was, let's say a tenant decided to boycott paying their rent to their landlord. The landlord would then evict those tenants from their property, and the local boards would allow those tenants to enter the workhouse, basically to make sure that they were looked after. This shouldn't have happened. This wasn't what the workhouse was for, but these southern unions started to do this. And the Ulster boards, they tried desperately not to allow politics and religion to enter their discussions. Limavady was one of those, and they actually took pride in their achievement. But this didn't stop other boards sending letters to the northern boards asking for support for political movements. And the central authorities strongly opposed this and advised all guardians not to engage in these discussions. And again, here we see Ballymoney's spirit coming out. So there was a man in Ballymoney called David Wilson, who was a grain merchant, and he was a guardian. And in one of their meetings, he was quoted as saying, so they'd received a letter from a southern board, and they had asked them to support the Home Rule movement. And David Wilson's response to this was, "I do not suppose this board would agree to the memorial sent by the Home Rule Association, but I do object to the local government board dictating to us on the subject and to interfere with our discussions." And many others in the boardroom at the time agreed with this statement. And I think this is one of my favourite quotes, because what he was essentially saying was, we're all aware in this room that we don't support Home Rule, But I totally resent the local government board telling me whether I can talk about it or not. I'm going to talk about whatever I want to talk about. They have no right to tell me what to do. And they, from this point, regularly and willingly discussed political things and religious things, regardless of what the local government board told them. So they were quite rebellious, but equally they were progressive, and they chose to use their position to look after the town as they saw fit, regardless of whether that was in line with how the law had intended it. And actually, as you come to the end of the 1800s, a law was introduced that allowed women to be elected as poor law guardians. The first poor law guardian that was a female was actually from Limavady. She was called Jane Ritter. But some boards in Ulster, they never had a woman on their board. Others, they thought they were very progressive and had one. But Ballymoney was outstanding, because between the years 1896 and 1939, they elected a total of 53 women. And that is a massive number. And even consider that in light of other Ulster unions never voting for women. And I think that's something for people from Ballymoney to be proud of. And in actual fact, one of their female guardians, I thought this was quite unusual too. When she was elected, she was only 19 years old. So that is really very young to be elected to that position. And when researching Ballymoney, I started to believe that Ballymoney had quite a unique, determined spirit until I started to research Ballycastle. So anybody from Ballycastle, you could maybe ask yourself all of those same questions that I asked the people from Ballymoney a wee while ago. And Ballycastle, it was a smaller union. It covered areas like Armoy, Ballycastle itself, and Rathlin. It was a smaller workhouse and a smaller union. The workhouse itself was only built to house 300 inmates. And it looked more, the next slide will show you, it looked more like Dunfanaghy Workhouse. So Dunfanaghy, you can actually still go and visit it today. It's a museum now, but you can see that it's a good bit smaller and the design is different than Ballymoney and Limavady's workhouse. The workhouse in Ballycastle, it ultimately became the Dalriada District Hospital. And as far as I know, the Fever Hospital still exists in Ballycastle today. So the story that stood out for me in Ballycastle was actually in 1884. And it was in relation to the master of the workhouse in Ballycastle. So the master was in charge. There was a master and a matron, and the master was in charge of the daily running of the workhouse. And the Ballycastle master got himself into a spot of bother. I find this story quite funny, but probably ultimately it wasn't that funny. But he had gotten into trouble with the authorities in Dublin because he had refused to keep a lady in the workhouse against her will. So she had been classified by the guardians as what they called a female lunatic. And the master said, look, she didn't want to be in there, so I wasn't going to keep her in there against her will. But they claimed that he had failed to do his duty as the master. And so they demanded that the master be removed from his position. And here's where that rebellious spirit comes in. The guardians refuse to remove him. So they say no, and they keep voting to keep the master in his position, and the local government board keep telling them, fire him. So this goes on back and forth for quite a while. They want him fired. The guardians keep on saying no. And interestingly, this very same master, a couple of years previously, they'd asked that he'd been fired then. But what the guardians tended to do was they would fire him and then revote him into the master's position, and hope that the local government board didn't notice. But eventually the local government board won, because what they said was, if you don't remove him as the master, we're going to send in replacement guardians and they're going to do the job for us. So they were left with no choice but to fire this master. And you would think, right, okay, that's the end of the independent Ballycastle spirit. But it doesn't end there. So the master refuses to leave the workhouse. So what the guardians have to do then is send for the local police, and the police have to physically remove the master from the workhouse, and they take him to the workhouse gates. Once there, they have to let go of the master to get him out the gate, but the master turns on his heel and runs back into the workhouse, refusing to hand over the keys, and he just sits himself down and point blank refuses to leave. And the final reference I found of this situation in the papers was that the reporter was writing that as far as he knew, the master was still sitting in the workhouse. And this issue was so relevant at the time that it actually made it into the discussions in the House of Commons, which I found very unusual. But there was quite a detailed conversation between various MPs about what was going on and basically about that rebellious nature of the Guardians. So as I've been mentioning throughout, this avoidance of political and religious issues was very important for the authorities in Dublin. They had realised when coming up with the law that Ireland's history meant that these issues could be contentious and problematic. And they had altered the English poor law to try and address this. So they'd entered a clause that meant that ministers of religion weren't allowed to be voted into the position of guardian. And they were trying to there prevent potential controversy. But what they'd failed to recognise, or maybe had recognised but didn't know how to address it, was how political and how religious Ireland was. And that when you involve people, so if you think the guardians or the residents in the workhouse, when you involve people from different backgrounds, it's always going to be problematic and difficult to manage. And Coleraine has an example from quite early on. In 1853, the master here and schoolmaster found themselves in trouble with Dublin because they had actually bribed 3 workhouse boys with a handful of blackberries to march in an orange procession through Coleraine town, holding banners and wearing ribbons. And this was definitely not allowed for numerous reasons, but most especially due to the fact that marching in an orange march at this stage was illegal. So both men were fired, never to be placed back on the staff there. So like I said, religion and politics were very contentious, but the most contentious was religion. And I'm going to end with some detail on Limavady. That's the union that I know the most about. And I apologise to anybody who heard my last talk in the workhouse in Limavady, because I'm going to reference one of the stories at least from there. But I think it's very relevant and actually very important and gives us great insight into how difficult it was at the time for the Guardians. So I'm going to read this bit to you actually, because it contains details of a little girl. So on the 20th of April 1907, 7-year-old Maggie Jane Mullen entered the Limavady Workhouse as a deserted Catholic night lodger. Mary Mullen entered the workhouse on the same night, registered immediately before Maggie. The following day, the Guardians agreed to Maggie being boarded out with Mary. By the 6th of May, the relieving officer submitted his report for Maggie, and the local government board approved Mary Mullen on the 20th of May. In October 1908, Mrs. Dickey, local government board lady inspector, mentioned Mary in her report. Mrs. Dickey was unhappy with Maggie's sleeping arrangements and asked that a separate bed be provided. The relieving officer immediately engaged with Mary and assured that same was supplied. 7 months later, the ladies' committee reported to the board that they had attended Mary's house and found her, quote, half drunk and very insolent, and the house was most untidy. The Guardians act swiftly and order that Maggie be removed from the care of Mary, with all Guardians agreeing to this decision. 2 weeks later, on the 24th of May, the ladies' committee identified a new Catholic foster mother. However, 2 Catholic Guardians voiced their objections. A vote was taken and the new foster mother is approved by 14 to 12. The relieving officer was instructed to attend Mary's house and remove the child from her care. However, Mary refused. And it is from this point when the foster mother, Mary Mullen, refuses that we actually begin to see, for the first time that I ever really find in Limavady's records, sectarian tensions rising quite dramatically. The sectarian tensions were recorded in the minutes, but only very vaguely. And where you get the most detail was actually in the local press. And what you see is battles in that boardroom, and there was some volatile tit for tat and back and forth. And it becomes clear that the little girl, Maggie, was baptized at birth as a Protestant, and later, whilst in the care of Mary Mullen, as a Catholic. and that her biological mother was Church of Ireland. And to give you a little insight into the story of this little girl, she was placed with Mary Mullen at birth. And she stayed with Mary for 7 years. And as Mary aged, her income was reduced and she could no longer afford to keep little Maggie. So the guardians, which is against the law, whether some of the guardians or all of the guardians, we don't know, agreed that Maggie could be entered as a deserted child onto their records, and that then Mary would be awarded custody of the little girl and she could look after her at home. But this way, the guardians would then pay Mary to look after Maggie and she wouldn't have to fund Maggie's care herself. And at this moment, where Maggie is now being removed from Mary, this is where what I would call the battle for Maggie's soul begins. So a battle unfolds in the boardroom between Protestant and Catholic board members for Maggie J. And everybody nearly becomes involved in the town. The local parish priest becomes involved. And you actually can see in the records that even though Mary wouldn't hand over Maggie to the guardians, she eventually handed Maggie over to the parish priest, and he placed the little girl in the care of another Catholic family. And this is so unusual. Why would they allow this to happen? And in the boardroom, to give you some indication of the kind of volatility that there was, one guardian began to accuse the Catholic members of the board of being crooked, that they had kidnapped the girl, that they were guilty of abduction. He apologized for having to touch on religious matters, but he felt that the Catholic members had been cunning. He advised that there was only one Catholic board member that he trusted, and he kept on discussing the true nature of the opposition to Maggie's removal. And he highlighted that Father Boyle, the parish priest, he seemed to have been the problem, and that the parish priest was encouraging the Catholic board members to be problematic in this situation. And so we see in Limavady a board that prided itself on avoiding religious issues. Here's an example of it just escalates into something that the majority of them wouldn't have wanted to happen, and true feelings flow out. It ended up before the magistrates. The magistrates, who, if you remember back at the start, they were guardians, they refused to make a decision. And so a resident magistrate had to be brought up from Dublin, and he eventually decides in favour of the guardians. But it actually appeared, this was a massive story. It was in the national news. It was known as the famous Limavady child custody case. And these battles of a sectarian nature continued for weeks. And things that were discussed in the boardroom. So one of the members said that, this is a quote from him, he had seen the child and asked it some questions, and he had asked it what religion it wanted to be, and it said Roman Catholic. And you can even see there in the language, Maggie didn't really matter to them. They called Maggie it the whole way through their discussions. And eventually, under the direction of the local government board, Maggie was handed over to her mother at the age of 10 in 1909, and people still weren't happy with it. There was still a lot of controversy. But very abruptly, the story ends. And these religious issues were not unique to Ulster, so we can think that maybe it was a very Ulster-related problem, but it wasn't. It was widespread throughout Ireland. This idea of how you register orphaned or deserted children was a major problem. There were suggestions that whatever police officer would bring a child to the workhouse, he should decide what religion the child should be, or whoever found the child should be registered in the religion of the person that found the child. And it had been so contentious because before the Church of Ireland was disestablished as the religion of the state, any children that were found in Ireland, they needed to be registered in the religion of the state, which was Church of Ireland. And if you think that at that point, the population of Ireland was 80% Catholic, you can see why this was problematic for a lot of people. So this case was definitely not unique to Limavady. It was maybe unique because it received such widespread press, but it really shows you how the tensions can escalate really quite quickly. And you began to see the guardians' personalities creep out. You see the magistrates, they refused to make a decision, kind of hoping that the issue would disappear. There were others who made quite a noise in the boardroom. Others tried really hard to stick to the law rigidly. and then there was others that remained completely silent. And I think what struck me in this story was that urban workhouses receive a lot of attention because they had to deal with a lot of people. So numerically, there were a lot more people in the workhouse. But rural workhouse guardians, they had greater local knowledge, they had relationships to protect, and this will ultimately have led them to finding it difficult to make decisions, especially on things like this that were so contentious. But as the poor law progressed, it did actually change dramatically. And it had begun, as I said at the start, as a method to deal with the poor. Yet when the law came to an end, it was very, very much more than that. And actually, the issue that brought Maggie J's case to an abrupt end highlights this. And I just want to end very briefly on this. So imagine being a hardworking member of Ulster society. You have a job and you can provide for your family. The workhouse has become more than a place for the poor. It now has a hospital attached to it. So this changeover, would you feel comfortable using this hospital? Would you trust that the staff were well trained and that they wanted to care properly for you and your family? And we probably all know the workhouses today became hospitals, and it's at this point in this time frame during the life of Maggie J that it was switching over. And as it was switching over, the Guardians and the local government board really had to deal with some very serious issues. And this is quite a sobering note to end on, because it ends with another 10-year-old girl, and she was called Martha Josephine Fennell. She was the daughter of Limavady's local Royal Irish Constabulary constable. She became sick with diphtheria, and the local workhouse doctor had advised her father to allow the little girl to be treated in the workhouse infirmary. And he brought her in on the 22nd of December, 1910. And the tension seemed to have existed straight away between the doctor and the father. The father didn't really seem to trust the doctor's opinion, constantly asking for a second opinion, and he was questioning every decision that the doctor made. So he didn't seem to trust the care that she would receive there. And there's actually an example reported whereby on Christmas Eve, the staff in the workhouse hospital reported that the father was found peering in through the window of the hospital to check on his daughter at 1 a.m. And he visited his little girl several times per day. He asked for more nurses to look after her. And he actually complained that the fire wasn't lit at different times, even though all evidence suggests that the staff in the workhouse hospital were looking after her very well. And he complained regularly about this care. And after receiving treatment in the hospital for a number of days, Martha Josephine Fennell died of diphtheria, aged 10. And Constable Fennell wouldn't accept that his daughter's death was unavoidable, and he would not accept that the cause of death, he wouldn't accept the cause of death that the doctor gave, which the doctor had believed was heart failure. And you see here how the poor law shifts again in the work that it was achieving, and it now becomes the site of medical inquest. And during this inquest, the grieving father accuses both the doctor and the nurse of serious neglect. He accuses the nurse of being drunk. He accuses them of mistreating his daughter. And he feels that the cause of her death was actually the prescribing of whiskey to treat her condition. And the constable's reaction could be explained by grief. However, given this constant questioning of the medical treatment that his daughter received, it does call us to question whether he trusted the workhouse at all to care for his child. And people's attitude towards the poor at the time probably will inform this thought for you. They didn't view the poor as the same as you and me. They spoke of the poor as if they were a different race. They weren't as important and they weren't as relevant. So surely in their minds, the care that a pauper would receive wouldn't be suitable for the daughter of a constable. And I wanted to end with a quote from a former president of Ireland, W.T. Cosgrove, who lived during the time of the poor law in Ireland. And it gives you some insight into how people viewed the poor in the workhouse. So I'm going to end with this quote. People reared in the workhouse, as you're aware, are no great acquisition to the community, and they have no ideas whatsoever of civic responsibilities. As a rule, their highest aim is to live at the expense of the ratepayer. Consequently, it would be a decided gain if they all took it into their heads to emigrate. When they go abroad, they are thrown on their own responsibilities and have to work whether they like it or not. So hopefully that was helpful. And if you have any questions, I'll try my best.
Sarah, thanks for a fascinating talk. So I'm going to throw the floor open to anyone who has any questions for Sarah. Oh, everybody seems to have got
either bored them to sleep or
no. Can I just say I really enjoyed it. I happen to live near Skibbereen when I'm living down south, so I'm very aware of Skibbereen and the awful thing that the famine was. We have a huge famine graveyard which is unmarked, and yeah, those of us in West Cork are very conscious of it. But I loved your talk. I live up here in Ballycastle now, so I know where the workhouse was. And I'm only dying to go to the newspaper archives to read all the stories you've told us about. So thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you.
So, Rosemary, did you want to say
yeah, just very, very quickly. Sarah, that was really, really interesting. I'm actually currently studying and the workhouse, the Limavady Workhouse is something I'm actually looking at for I'm halfway through a master's. But my question was about the night lodgers. I had been aware of poor law from studying social history through work, but I hadn't come across the night lodgers until very, very recently. And they did seem to use in Limavady, where I came across it. Would you say that they were using the workhouses to travel around the country, almost like Airbnbs, to kind of, because most of the entries are talking about that they had occupations and were healthy, and you can see very quickly. I think I looked at 1910, where they repeatedly came within a season. Would you agree? Were using it as transporting themselves around the country? Was it because the rural workhouses were a bit more relaxed about them staying? They kind of, there's like, you see the entries where they would say they came for dinner and stayed for breakfast and then left. They came the night before and then left in the morning and maybe were away for a week or two and then came back again. Would you say it was because the rural workhouses were slightly more relaxed about the rules? They clearly weren't paupers.
Yes and no. Maybe what I would suggest is that so my supervisor has looked at Belfast Workhouse, and I've read quite a bit on the two workhouses in Dublin. You would need to be pretty desperate to go to either of those or any of those three workhouses. They were very, very badly, I want to say managed, but probably the conditions were bad. They had so many people to deal with, they just didn't have time to manage them. So I know Limavady's especially, it was a very well-run workhouse in terms of workhouses anyway. You wouldn't want to stay there yourself, but because they had fewer people in the workhouse, they had more time to maintain them and make sure that they were as good as they could be. And probably you'll find as well that the type of work people were traveling around Ireland for, you weren't going to find that in Belfast or Dublin. So I must actually ask Alwyn about this, but when you look at Belfast Workhouse, the majority of them are going to be from Belfast. So they've maybe migrated from rural communities to Belfast, but they are employed in manufacturing, so in industry. And the slums in Belfast were so bad that often people then ended up in the workhouse. So essentially, if you were a cooper or you were involved in the linen industry, that type of profession, you're not going to find employment in Belfast. You're going to find it throughout those rural communities. Or if you were a labourer, a farm labourer, and you couldn't find work in your local area, you could travel to other areas. So I think it's probably more to do with the types of professions rather than they were more relaxed. Although from looking at Limavady, they seem to be more willing to play around with the law. But yeah, I think it was probably more to do with the type of work that people were looking for, rather than that they were more lax.
That's really helpful.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate the talk. Very enjoyable. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, if no one has any further questions for Sarah, we'll maybe call a halt this evening. And again, Sarah, thank you. I know I did hear your talk over in Limavady, but there was an awful lot of new information in that one this evening, and I enjoyed it every bit as much as I enjoyed Limavady's talk. So as again, thank you very much, and I hope you'll all join us again next week when we'll welcome Deirdre Goodlad, who'll look at the Irish language in Northampton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I think that's us then, is it? You're muted.
You just need to stop that recording, Joanne.
Right, so I go into more.